"You'll regret this." A rancher acted recklessly, and 300 warriors arrived the next morning. From sunrise to sunset, he worked tirelessly to maintain the fields, repair fences, feed the cattle, and make sure everything ran smoothly. To him, the ranch was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of his independence and the hard work he had put into life. Thomas had inherited the land from his father, who had taught him the value of diligence, perseverance, and standing firm in the face of trouble. Over the years, Thomas had become known in the surrounding villages as a stubborn man, someone who took pride in being self-reliant and never backing down, no matter the odds. One afternoon, as Thomas was inspecting the northern fence line, he noticed several areas where the wire had been disturbed. The ground was soft from recent rain, making footprints visible to his trained eye. Some of the prints were unfamiliar. They did not belong to any of the neighboring farmers who occasionally came by to trade or visit. Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing as he crouched to study the tracks. They appeared fresh, perhaps made just that morning. His mind immediately jumped to the warnings he had heard weeks earlier from nearby villagers. A small group of local tribesmen had been accused of stealing livestock from farms on the outskirts of the valley. They had always kept to themselves, but occasionally desperate circumstances had pushed them to raid, often leaving farmers frustrated and fearful. Thomas' mind was made up. He had faced challenges before, from wild animals to harsh winters, and he had always found a way to protect what was his. But he had never dealt with humans who trespassed and stole. A spark of anger flared within him as he thought about the consequences of leaving his property vulnerable. "They think they can take what's mine without consequence," he muttered under his breath, running his hand through his hair. "They'll learn soon enough." He returned to the ranch house, a sturdy structure of timber and stone that had been in his family for generations. Inside, his wife, Margaret, was tending to the fire, her gentle movements providing a stark contrast to Thomas' growing agitation. Their children, Emily and Jacob, played quietly in the corner, unaware of the storm brewing in their father's mind. Thomas paced back and forth, recounting the tracks he had found and his thoughts on how to deal with the intruders. Margaret listened carefully, worry etched across her face. "Thomas, you can't handle this alone," she said softly. "Maybe we should call for help or speak to the village council." But Thomas waved her concern away with a firm hand. "No, Margaret, I can handle it. I've always handled it. I won't let anyone threaten our home, our land. If I act now, they'll think twice before ever coming near again." His eyes burned with determination, but Margaret could sense the recklessness in his words. She knew that his stubborn nature often led him to make choices without considering the full consequences. Ignoring her pleas, Thomas began to gather supplies. He collected ropes, traps, and a few firearms he kept for emergencies. He even had a small supply of homemade explosives, which he had used in the past to clear rockslides that blocked paths or fences. He justified this dangerous choice by convincing himself that it was the only way to protect his family and his ranch. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the valley in shades of orange and gold, Thomas worked quickly to prepare his defenses. He set traps along the paths that led to his property and reinforced the fences, making sure each area was strategically covered. As darkness approached, the ranch transformed. Shadows stretched across the fields and the quiet sounds of night began to fill the air, crickets chirping, the wind rustling through the trees, and the distant call of an owl. Thomas walked the perimeter one last time, checking each trap and making sure everything was in place. He felt a mixture of excitement and unease. On one hand, he was confident in his plan. On the other, a small voice inside him whispered doubt, a warning that perhaps he had underestimated the situation. Thomas shook his head, dismissing it. "I know what I'm doing," he muttered to himself. "I've faced worse than this." Inside the ranch house, Margaret prepared a simple dinner, her eyes frequently glancing toward the darkened windows. She worried for Thomas, knowing that his plan was dangerous and could have consequences far beyond what he imagined. The children laughed softly over a game of cards, but even their innocent joy could not mask the tension in the room. Margaret hoped that Thomas would reconsider, that he would seek counsel or wait for assistance, but she knew that once he set his mind on something, there was little that could change it. As night fell completely, Thomas sat alone by the fireplace, planning his next steps. He reviewed the maps of his land, noting each path, each hidden corner where intruders might approach. He thought about the stories he had heard from neighboring farmers, tales of revenge and retaliation from the tribes. He steeled himself against fear, convincing himself that preparation and courage would see him through. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of anticipation. Meanwhile, in the nearby village, news of Thomas' preparations began to spread. Villagers spoke in hushed tones about the rancher who had decided to act alone, who had set traps and armed himself to face the trespassers. Some admired his courage, while others shook their heads, fearing that his recklessness could bring disaster. Unknown to Thomas, the tribesmen had also been made aware of his actions. Word traveled quickly among them, carried by scouts who had observed the ranch from the hills. The council of tribal leaders convened late into the night, discussing the young rancher's boldness and the potential threat he posed. Their decision was unanimous. They would respond, but carefully. 300 warriors would prepare quietly to travel to Thomas Valley, ensuring that their presence would be known at the right moment. Back at the ranch, Thomas finally lay down to rest, exhaustion finally taking over his body. He dreamed of success, of standing tall and victorious, of teaching the trespassers a lesson they would never forget. In his mind, he imagined them fleeing in fear, respecting the strength and resolve of the man who dared to protect his home. But deep down, a tiny seed of worry lingered, a subtle nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had underestimated what was coming. The night stretched on, quiet and tense, with the ranch bathed in the soft glow of the moon. The cattle huddled together in the fields, unaware of the drama unfolding, and the wind carried faint sounds across the valley. Thomas' story, like the valley itself, was about to change. A single reckless decision, fueled by pride and stubbornness, had set in motion a series of events that would test him in ways he could never have imagined. By morning, the peaceful valley would no longer be just a home. It would become the stage for a lesson in humility, courage, and the consequences of acting without foresight. As the hours passed, the darkness seemed to grow heavier, almost alive, and Thomas slept fitfully, caught between dreams of triumph and the faint whisper of doubt. Little did he know that by the time the sun rose, his world would be surrounded by an unexpected force, and the choices he had made in anger and pride would lead to a confrontation that would be remembered long after the dust settled. The night had grown darker over the valley, and a quiet tension hung in the air. Thomas Hale's ranch, usually peaceful and calm, now seemed alive with anticipation, as if the land itself knew that something extraordinary was about to happen. The fences he had reinforced glimmered faintly under the moonlight, and the traps he had set along the paths remained hidden in the shadows, waiting for intruders who might never come, or who might come in far greater numbers than he imagined. Thomas paced quietly inside the ranch house, checking the locked doors and windows for the third time. He listened carefully to the soft sounds of the night, the distant cry of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the trees, and the low murmur of the cattle in the fields. Each sound seemed amplified in the stillness, and every shadow outside the windows made him tense. He had prepared himself for a confrontation, and yet a small part of him, deep down, could not ignore the faint chill running through his spine. Margaret, his wife, watched him with a mixture of concern and fear. She had tried repeatedly to convince him to call for help, to wait for advice from the village council, but Thomas had brushed off every suggestion. "I don't need anyone," he had said. "I can handle this. We've survived worse than a few trespassers." But Margaret could see that his confidence, while strong, was edging dangerously close to overconfidence. The thought of what might happen if he misjudged the situation kept her awake, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. Meanwhile, not far from the ranch, news of Thomas' preparations had already reached the tribe. A few scouts who had been observing the valley from the hills reported the rancher's movements and the traps he had set. The tribal leaders called an emergency council in their village. The elders, wise and experienced, listened carefully to the reports. Young warriors were eager for action, but the elders reminded them that haste could be dangerous. "The man is reckless," one elder said. "He may think he is ready, but he does not understand what he faces. We must act carefully, but we cannot ignore his defiance." The council debated through the night. The tribe had faced conflicts with outsiders before, but rarely had they encountered someone who acted so boldly, so recklessly, without provocation beyond mere suspicion. They agreed to send a force of 300 warriors to the valley, not to attack blindly, but to teach a lesson in a measured and decisive way. Every detail was planned: the approach routes, the timing, and how they would position themselves around the ranch without alarming Thomas too early. They wanted the rancher to realize the consequences of his actions, but they also wanted to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Discipline and strategy would guide their steps. Back at the ranch, Thomas was oblivious to the council and planning happening just a few miles away. He spent the rest of the evening preparing the perimeter one last time. He checked each trap, tested the mechanisms, and reinforced the weaker areas of the fence. He even dug small pits covered with branches and leaves along the most likely paths of approach. His mind was entirely focused on the challenge ahead, on proving that he could protect his land and family. Each creak of the wooden floorboards under his feet seemed louder than usual, and every wind gust made him glance toward the windows with suspicion. Margaret served dinner quietly, hoping that Thomas would eat and regain some calm, but he ate mechanically, consumed by his thoughts and plans. "Thomas," she said softly, "you're taking too much on yourself. The land, the traps, it's dangerous. You shouldn't be alone in this." Thomas looked up from his plate, his eyes firm but weary. "Margaret, I know it's dangerous, but if I don't do this, who will? We have to stand our ground. If I falter, everything we've worked for could be lost. I cannot allow that." His voice carried determination, but Margaret saw the strain behind his words. She wanted to argue, to insist that he take a step back, but she knew it was useless. Thomas' mind was made up, and he would not be swayed. As the night deepened, Thomas decided to walk the perimeter of the ranch one final time. He carried a lantern and moved cautiously, listening for the slightest sound. The valley seemed unusually quiet, almost too quiet. Every rustle of leaves or distant animal cry made him tense. He stopped at one corner of the property, peering into the darkness. The moon cast long shadows across the fields, and he imagined shapes moving in the distance, enemies waiting for the right moment to strike. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline that came from anticipation. He felt alive, alert, and ready, yet the tiny voice of doubt at the back of his mind persisted, whispering that he may have underestimated the situation. Inside the ranch house, Margaret and the children tried to remain calm. Emily and Jacob were unaware of the danger, playing quietly near the fireplace, but they sensed the tension in the air. Margaret decided to keep them occupied with stories and games, trying to shield them from the worry that weighed heavily on her. She glanced out the window, watching the shadows stretch across the fields. Every now and then she thought she saw movement, but it could have been just the wind. Her heart beat faster, knowing that Thomas had gone out into the night alone, facing unknown risks. Meanwhile, in the tribe's village, preparations were underway. The warriors gathered quietly, checking their equipment and supplies. Leaders reminded them to remain disciplined, to approach the ranch with care and strategy rather than force alone. The younger warriors were excited, eager to confront the man who had dared to challenge them, but the elders ensured that everyone understood the importance of patience and caution. They would move under the cover of darkness silently and be ready to surround the ranch by morning. Every step was calculated, every decision made with precision. Back at the ranch, Thomas spent hours moving around the property, double-checking everything he had set up. He was meticulous, knowing that even a small mistake could cost him dearly. He felt a mix of pride and anxiety, pride in his preparation, anxiety in the uncertainty of what he would face. The night dragged on, each hour stretching longer as he waited for any sign of movement. He whispered to himself, imagining the moment when the trespassers would arrive and be met with his traps and defenses. The hours passed slowly, and Thomas began to feel the fatigue in his bones. He finally returned to the ranch house to rest, though his sleep would be uneasy. Every sound in the night, the wind, the distant cries of animals, the creaking of the floorboards, kept him alert. He dreamt of confrontation, imagining the intruders being caught in his traps, fleeing in fear, and never daring to return. Yet even in his dreams, the tiny seed of doubt persisted, a subtle reminder that he may have overestimated his ability to control the outcome. As the night continued, the valley seemed to hold its breath. The ranch, normally a place of routine and calm, had become a stage set for a momentous event. Thomas, driven by pride and determination, had prepared for what he thought would be a minor confrontation. But the forces moving quietly through the hills were far greater than he imagined. By morning, the quiet valley would be transformed, and the consequences of one man's reckless decision would begin to unfold in ways he could not foresee. In the early hours before dawn, Thomas rose once again, checking the horizon for any signs of movement. The valley was cloaked in darkness, with only the faint light of the moon to guide him. He felt a mixture of anticipation, pride, and a lingering sense of unease. Little did he know that the very tribe he had underestimated was moving silently toward his ranch, 300 strong, prepared to confront him with a force he had never faced before. Every step they took was deliberate, every breath measured, as they approached the valley where Thomas Hale's fate would soon be decided. The night was almost over, and the first hints of dawn would soon reveal the scale of what Thomas had set into motion. His determination, his stubbornness, and his reckless bravery had all led to this moment. The quiet tension that had filled the valley for hours was about to explode into action, and the events that would follow would teach lessons about courage, humility, and the unforeseen consequences of acting without caution. Thomas could not know it yet, but by the time the sun rose over the hills, his life and the tranquility of his ranch would be forever changed. The reckless choice he had made, driven by pride and a desire to protect his home, was about to collide with the reality of a well-organized and determined force moving steadily toward him. And in that collision, he would discover that preparation, courage, and determination, while important, were not always enough to face the unexpected. The first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, brushing the hills with a soft golden glow. The valley remained quiet, almost deceptively peaceful, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Thomas Hale, exhausted from the restless night, had taken short, fitful naps by the fireplace. Each time he closed his eyes, his dreams were filled with the intruders he expected to confront. He imagined them falling into traps, fleeing in fear, and realizing too late that they had underestimated him. Yet beneath his confidence, a faint sense of unease lingered, a whisper that something larger, more organized, might be approaching. Thomas rose early, even before the sun fully revealed itself. He stepped outside, breathing in the cool morning air, which carried the fresh scent of dew and earth. The ranch stretched out before him, peaceful in appearance, but his trained eyes noticed small irregularities. A branch bent in a way it shouldn't have, a hoofprint in the soft soil that didn't belong to any of his cattle, and faint shadows that shifted too quickly to be caused by the wind. His heart began to race. Could it be possible that someone had already approached the ranch during the night? He shook his head, trying to calm himself. "It's probably nothing," he muttered, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Thomas decided to walk the perimeter once more, lantern in hand, inspecting every trap, every fence post, every possible point of entry. His mind worked like a machine, calculating angles, distances, and the possible paths intruders might take. Every detail mattered, and he could not allow himself to make a single mistake. Yet, as he moved quietly through the fields, a growing sense of tension took root. Something about the stillness felt different this morning. The wind had stopped. The birds remained unusually silent. Even the cattle seemed alert, ears twitching, eyes scanning the edges of the fields. It was as if the valley itself sensed the danger approaching. Meanwhile, in the hills surrounding the valley, the tribe moved with quiet precision. 300 warriors advanced carefully, each step deliberate, their formation tight but silent. Elders and leaders had instructed them not to make any unnecessary noise, not to reveal their presence until the right moment. They knew that Thomas was alone, that he relied on his traps and weapons, and that surprise would give them the advantage. Scouts at the front and rear ensured that no sound betrayed their movement, while the center maintained cohesion, ready to surround the ranch once they reached the valley floor. Back at the ranch, Thomas began noticing subtle signs that someone, or something, was near. Footprints appeared in places that had been clear the night before. Twigs and grass were disturbed along paths that led toward the northern fence. A low rustling echoed through the trees, so faint that it could have been mistaken for the wind, yet Thomas' instincts told him otherwise. His adrenaline surged. He picked up his rifle and moved quietly toward the fence line, crouching low and scanning every shadow. Every fiber of his being was alert, trained for the confrontation he believed was imminent. He whispered to himself, running through his plan once more. The traps were set, the fences reinforced, and he had prepared escape routes in case things went wrong. Still, the signs of recent activity unsettled him. He had thought he would be the hunter, not the hunted. But now, a small, nagging fear crept into his mind. Perhaps the intruders were more organized than he had imagined. He shook the thought away. "I am ready for them," he said aloud, his voice steady but tense. "I will protect my home no matter what." Inside the ranch house, Margaret and the children remained quiet. She had noticed Thomas' unease and tried to keep him calm, but he was restless, pacing back and forth, checking every detail. The children played softly in the corner, unaware of the growing tension. Margaret prepared a simple breakfast but did not insist that Thomas eat. She knew he needed to focus, to be aware, and forcing him to sit would do little to calm his mind. Instead, she watched silently, hoping that Thomas' preparations would be enough, even though deep down she feared they might not. As the morning progressed, Thomas began seeing more signs that the situation was escalating. A faint glimmer of metal caught his eye among the grass, too deliberate to be natural. A trail of footprints seemed to converge toward one of his trap lines. The wind carried sounds now, low murmurs, distant but rhythmic, that suggested the presence of people moving in formation. His pulse quickened. He realized that the confrontation he had expected to be small and manageable was something far larger, something he had not fully anticipated. His mind raced, analyzing possibilities, planning contingencies, and calculating the risks of each action. From their vantage points in the hills, the tribe's leaders observed Thomas' movements. They noted his preparation, his vigilance, and the visible signs of tension on his face. He was clearly aware that something was approaching, but he had no idea of the scale of the force surrounding him. The elders exchanged nods. Their plan was working. They would allow him to sense their presence, to feel the tension rising, before revealing the full force of their numbers. Discipline, strategy, and timing were their greatest advantages, and they moved with careful coordination, ensuring that no sound or misstep would betray their position prematurely. Thomas returned to the ranch house, feeling a mix of confidence and worry. He checked the doors and windows again, ensuring that every possible entry point was secure. He walked through the living area, inspecting the positions of furniture that could be used as barricades, noting the best spots to defend in case of a direct confrontation. His rifle was ready, ammunition checked, traps reviewed mentally one last time. He could feel the tension building, a tight coil in his chest, but he told himself that he was ready. He was the master of his land, and no intruder would catch him off guard. Outside, the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the valley, casting long shadows across the fields. The movement of the tribe became more discernible as they approached, though they remained hidden in the tree line, careful to stay out of sight. Thomas noticed the faint signs, the disturbed ground, the subtle shadows, the barely audible rustle of clothing and equipment, but he still could not comprehend the magnitude of what was coming. 300 warriors were advancing toward him, silent, disciplined, and ready to surround the ranch. Each step they took was deliberate, their presence almost ghost-like as they closed in under the early morning light. Thomas moved toward the northern fence line once more, his eyes scanning the distance. He could see the faint outlines of figures in the trees, glimpses that made his pulse quicken. His confidence wavered for a moment as he realized he was no longer alone, that the intruders were near, organized, and far more numerous than he had imagined. Panic threatened to take hold, but he forced himself to focus, to rely on his preparation and training. Every trap, every fence post, every strategic placement of obstacles was part of his defense. He would not back down, not now, not ever. Margaret, watching from the window, sensed the change in Thomas. His movements had become more urgent, more precise, but also more tense. She could see the worry in his eyes, the way his hands clenched the rifle, the way he paused frequently to listen to the subtle sounds around him. She knew he was beginning to understand that the situation was more serious than he had anticipated. Yet, even as fear began to creep into her own heart, she admired his courage, his unwavering commitment to protecting their home and family. The tribe moved closer, carefully navigating the terrain to avoid detection. Leaders communicated silently, using hand signals and subtle gestures to guide the warriors. They were nearly in position, surrounding the ranch from all sides, their presence unseen but increasingly felt. Thomas noticed more signs, broken branches, footprints converging on multiple paths, and the distant echo of coordinated movement. His sense of urgency grew. The confrontation he had prepared for, the one he had believed would be simple, was now far more complex and dangerous. He realized that he was outnumbered, but he refused to give in to fear. He would face whatever came, relying on his wits, his courage, and the defenses he had carefully laid out. As the sun rose fully, casting a warm glow over the valley, Thomas stood at the center of his land, surveying the scene. The traps were set, the fences reinforced, and the perimeter checked countless times. Yet the signs of a growing force surrounding him were undeniable. Panic and anticipation battled within him. He felt the weight of responsibility for his family and his land pressing heavily on his shoulders. Every instinct told him that the coming confrontation would be unlike anything he had faced before. And then Thomas noticed something that made his heart skip a beat, a shadow moving quickly and deliberately, not like an animal, not like the wind, but like a coordinated human presence. The realization struck him. He was no longer facing a small group of trespassers. He was facing an organized, disciplined force. The full scale of the danger hit him for the first time. His breath quickened, his pulse surged, and a sense of urgency overtook him. This was no longer a simple defense of his land. This was a test of courage, strategy, and survival. Thomas Hale, the stubborn and proud rancher, now stood at the brink of a confrontation that would test every ounce of his preparation and resolve. The signs were all around him. The disturbed ground, the shadows moving in the distance, the faint sounds of coordinated movement. The valley, once peaceful and calm, had become a stage for a dramatic encounter that would reveal the consequences of reckless decisions. The sun had fully risen over the valley, spreading warm light across the fields and hills. But the warmth of the morning could not reach the tension that gripped Thomas Hale's heart. He stood at the edge of his ranch, peering into the shadows of the trees, scanning for movement. His traps were set, fences fortified, and rifles loaded. Every inch of the property had been inspected countless times, and yet the growing signs of presence, footprints, broken branches, faint rustling, told him one undeniable truth: the intruders had arrived. Thomas' mind raced. He tried to stay calm, but the size of the force slowly became clear. The movement in the trees was deliberate and coordinated. Shadows shifted as if alive with intention, and the faint sound of rhythmic steps carried through the valley. He realized with growing dread that this was far more than a simple raid or a small group of trespassers. He was facing hundreds of people, organized, disciplined, and fully aware of his defenses. His heart pounded in his chest, yet he refused to show fear. Pride and determination held him firm. "I will protect this land," he muttered to himself. "No one will take it from me." Meanwhile, the tribal warriors advanced quietly but with precision. Leaders had positioned scouts at strategic points to ensure that Thomas would feel their presence but not see their full strength. Their goal was clear: surround the ranch, demonstrate their power, and ensure that Thomas understood the consequences of acting recklessly. 300 warriors, moving as one, approached the perimeter. Each carried the tools and weapons they needed, but no unnecessary noise betrayed their arrival. They were a force to be reckoned with, disciplined and patient, moving closer with each passing minute. Thomas moved along the fence line, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning every shadow. He noted footprints and the disturbed earth, each sign reinforcing the realization that he was surrounded. Adrenaline surged through him as he considered his options. Every trap was double-checked, every fence reinforced, yet a creeping sense of doubt gnawed at him. For the first time, he considered that his preparations, however meticulous, might not be enough to face what was coming. Margaret and the children watched from inside the ranch house. Emily clung to her mother's hand while Jacob's eyes widened at the distant sounds. Margaret could see the tension in Thomas' movements, the rigid determination, and the occasional flicker of unease. She wished he could see what she saw, the overwhelming scale of the force gathering outside. She hoped that his courage would carry him through, but she could not deny the fear that clutched at her heart. The warriors had now reached positions near the outer edges of the ranch. From the trees and the hills, their presence was almost tangible. Their movements were careful, strategic, and silent. Thomas could see glimpses of them now, shapes between the trees, the faint glimmer of sunlight reflecting off metal, the precise coordination of many individuals moving as one. Panic threatened to creep into his mind, but he forced it aside, relying on the training and preparation that had kept him alive in countless situations before. He moved to the northern fence line, where the majority of his traps were placed. The disturbed ground indicated that someone had already tested the perimeter. He checked each trap quickly, adjusting and reinforcing where necessary. His hands moved with speed and precision, though his heart raced. He realized that he was no longer the hunter but the hunted. The intruders were organized, and he had no way of knowing their full strength. Each movement in the shadows, each faint sound, reminded him of the danger that was closing in with alarming speed. The first warrior emerged from the trees silently, with careful steps that avoided the traps. Thomas noticed immediately. His pulse surged and he aimed his rifle, preparing for the first confrontation. But the warrior did not attack. He paused, standing motionless as if assessing the situation. Then, almost imperceptibly, he moved aside, signaling that the main force was behind him. Thomas realized the extent of the danger. This was not a single intruder. It was an army, a well-prepared, coordinated force that had surrounded his ranch and was waiting for the right moment to act. From the tree line, the rest of the warriors began to take positions, gradually encircling the property. Leaders communicated with subtle gestures and hand signals, ensuring that every warrior knew their place. The movement was deliberate, methodical, and almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. Thomas watched, rifle raised, trying to anticipate their actions. Every second brought new signs of activity, shadows shifting, faint footsteps, and the occasional glint of sunlight off weapons or tools. The tension in the valley was almost unbearable, a quiet energy that pressed down on the ranch and its inhabitants. Thomas moved back toward the center of the ranch, surveying the scene. He could see the faint outline of several figures in the distance, emerging from the trees, moving in formation. He realized that the intruders were far more organized and numerous than he had imagined. His mind raced with strategies, calculating how to use the traps, the fences, and his own skills to maintain control. He knew he could not confront them all directly, but he hoped that his preparation would buy him enough time to protect his family and property. Margaret watched Thomas, noting the way he moved with both precision and urgency. She could see that he was aware of the growing threat but refused to show fear. Her heart ached for him, for the children, and for the danger that surrounded them. She whispered softly, more to herself than anyone else, "Be safe, Thomas. Please be safe." Her words seemed swallowed by the stillness of the valley, carrying only hope into the tense morning air. The warriors now moved closer, positioning themselves around key points of the ranch. Their strategy was clear: surround, observe, and wait for Thomas to make the first move. They respected him as a brave man, but needed to ensure that his reckless actions were met with measured consequences. The leaders signaled to their men, directing them silently with gestures that ensured no one acted prematurely. Each movement was part of a larger plan, a coordinated effort to demonstrate both discipline and strength. Thomas noticed subtle changes in the environment, the way the shadows moved, the faint crunch of leaves under careful footsteps, the almost imperceptible shifts in the air as hundreds of people took positions. His confidence wavered for a moment, replaced by a surge of tension he had never felt before. He realized that his actions had led to this moment, that his reckless decision to prepare alone had placed him in a situation far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Yet he refused to retreat. He would face whatever came, relying on his preparation, his courage, and his quick thinking. Suddenly, a loud, clear voice broke the quiet of the morning. It was a leader from the tribe, stepping forward into the open, signaling his presence without aggression but with authority. "Thomas Hale," he called, his voice echoing across the valley. "You have acted recklessly on land that does not belong to you alone. You have prepared traps and weapons without understanding the consequences. You will see now that your actions have invited this response." Thomas froze for a moment, recognizing the voice as calm yet commanding. His mind raced, weighing options, considering his traps and defenses and calculating his next steps. The leader continued, emphasizing both discipline and restraint. "We do not seek unnecessary bloodshed," he said. "But you must understand that pride and impulsiveness carry consequences." The rancher's heart pounded. He realized that he was no longer dealing with a few intruders, but with a highly organized, disciplined force surrounding him completely. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. The safety of his family, the preservation of his land, and the consequences of his earlier decisions. Every trap, every rifle, every piece of preparation he had relied on now faced an immense challenge. Thomas raised his rifle slightly, aiming toward the voice, though he knew it was only a warning, not an immediate attack. His thoughts flashed between pride and fear, strategy and survival. He had always considered himself capable of handling challenges alone, but now he faced a force that dwarfed his expectations. The lessons he had learned from past hardships, while valuable, felt inadequate in the face of overwhelming numbers and organization. Margaret moved closer to the children, holding them tightly, whispering reassurances that masked her own fear. She could see Thomas' determination, his courage, and his stubborn refusal to yield, but she also saw the moment of realization in his eyes, that this confrontation was far greater than he had imagined. The tension in the valley was nearly tangible, a thick energy that pressed on every living thing within it. The warriors positioned themselves carefully, ensuring that Thomas could see their numbers without being overwhelmed too quickly. The leaders signaled, subtly and methodically, demonstrating that the situation was under control and that the ranchers' actions would not go unnoticed or unchallenged. The valley, which had seemed peaceful only hours ago, was now alive with anticipation, each movement carrying the weight of discipline, courage, and strategy. Thomas knew that the moment of truth had arrived. He could see the faces of the warriors, the deliberate movements, and the careful coordination of the group. Every instinct in his body screamed that he was outnumbered, but he refused to show fear. He would rely on his preparation, his skill, and his determination to face the challenge. The ranch, his home, and his family depended on him. And as the morning sun climbed higher, illuminating the scene in stark detail, Thomas Hale prepared himself for the confrontation that would define the day, and perhaps change his life forever. The morning sun climbed higher, casting its golden light across Thomas Hale's ranch, illuminating the surrounding hills and fields. The valley, once quiet and serene, now hummed with tension. Thomas stood at the center of his land, rifle in hand, surrounded by the faint but unmistakable signs of the 300 warriors who had silently encircled his property. Each shadow, each rustle in the grass, reminded him of the immense force he faced. His heart pounded, but he refused to show fear. He had prepared, planned, and fought countless challenges in his life, yet this moment dwarfed them all. Margaret and the children huddled inside the ranch house, peering cautiously through the windows. Margaret's mind raced with fear, concern, and hope all at once. She had watched Thomas throughout the night and morning, seen his determination, and known the stubborn pride that drove him. But now, witnessing the overwhelming scale of the force surrounding the ranch, she realized that his courage alone might not be enough. She whispered softly to Emily and Jacob, urging them to stay calm and hold their hands tightly. She knew that their safety depended on Thomas' choices in the next crucial moments. The tribal leader stepped forward, emerging into the open just far enough for Thomas to see him clearly. His stance was firm, commanding, yet his eyes conveyed discipline rather than aggression. He called out to Thomas, his voice echoing across the valley. "Thomas Hale," he said, "you have acted recklessly. Your pride and impulsiveness have brought you to this moment. You have set traps, prepared weapons, and acted without understanding the consequences. You will see now the result of your actions." Thomas' pulse surged. His fingers tightened around the rifle, and his eyes swept the perimeter of the ranch. He could see more of the warriors now, moving with precision and coordination, positioning themselves strategically around the property. The scale of the force, combined with the silent discipline of the warriors, impressed upon him the seriousness of the situation. For the first time, he understood that this was not just a confrontation, it was a lesson, a test of his judgment, courage, and humility. He took a deep breath and called out in response, his voice steady but tinged with tension. "I only wanted to protect my home and family. I meant no harm beyond defending what is mine. If you have come to teach me, then I am ready to listen." There was a pause, the silence of the valley almost overwhelming, before the tribal leader nodded slightly, signaling that Thomas' words had been heard. The warriors remained in place, a disciplined and controlled presence that emphasized their strength without immediate aggression. Thomas realized that he had a choice. He could continue to fight, relying on his traps and weapons, risking escalation and potential harm to himself and his family, or he could recognize the wisdom in restraint and negotiation. His pride wrestled with reason. He had always prided himself on his independence and courage, yet he now saw the limits of acting alone, without foresight or counsel. The valley, once a place of security, now reminded him that even the strongest individuals could be tested by forces beyond their control. Margaret, watching Thomas, felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that the situation had not yet escalated into violence, fear because she understood how close it had come. She whispered to her children, urging them to stay behind the sturdy walls of the ranch house, and silently prayed that Thomas, wisdom and courage would guide him through the unfolding situation. The tribal leader raised his hand, signaling the warriors to hold their positions. He spoke again, this time directly addressing Thomas' pride and choices. "Courage is admirable, Thomas Hale, but pride and impulsiveness can bring danger. You have tested your limits, and now you face the consequences. Yet strength also comes with wisdom, the understanding of when to act and when to restrain." His words echoed in the valley, carrying both authority and reason. Thomas felt the weight of his decisions pressing upon him. Slowly he lowered his rifle, a gesture of recognition rather than surrender. "I see now," he said quietly, "that I acted without thinking of the consequences. I let my pride guide me, and it has brought danger to my family and my land. I will listen and learn from this moment." The tribal leader nodded again, a subtle acknowledgement of Thomas, humility and willingness to accept responsibility. The tension in the valley began to ease slightly, though the disciplined presence of the warriors remained, a reminder that this was a serious lesson, not a casual encounter. The tribal leaders then approached the ranch carefully, signaling that they intended no violence, only dialogue. Thomas stepped forward cautiously, meeting them in the open, maintaining a posture that was respectful yet firm. Margaret and the children remained behind, safe inside the house, but their eyes watched anxiously as the meeting unfolded. Words were exchanged, not of threats, but of understanding, respect, and acknowledgement of the danger that had been created by reckless action. Thomas spoke honestly, recounting his fears, his pride, and his motivations for preparing alone. He admitted that his decisions had been impulsive, driven by a desire to protect his home, yet lacking in foresight and wisdom. The tribal leaders listened attentively, noting his honesty and willingness to accept responsibility. They recognized his courage, but emphasized that courage must be guided by judgment and consideration for consequences. The interaction was tense yet transformative. The warriors around the ranch maintained their positions but relaxed slightly, sensing the shift in Thomas' demeanor. He was no longer a stubborn, reckless man acting alone. He was now someone who recognized the limits of his actions, someone willing to learn from a situation far greater than himself. The valley, once charged with imminent confrontation, now seemed to breathe with cautious relief, as if acknowledging the mutual understanding forming between the rancher and the tribe. Thomas and the tribal leader spoke at length, discussing the boundaries of the land, the importance of communication, and the dangers of impulsive action. Thomas promised to respect the surrounding communities, to seek counsel before acting in the future, and to ensure that his pride would not cloud his judgment again. The leader, in turn, emphasized the importance of courage balanced with wisdom, and the responsibility that came with living in a community with others who depended on mutual respect and understanding. Margaret stepped outside cautiously, carrying the children. She approached Thomas, her eyes filled with relief, love, and gratitude. Thomas embraced his family, feeling the immense weight of the morning's events lift slightly. The warriors, seeing the peaceful gesture, relaxed further, though their disciplined formation remained as a reminder that the situation could have gone differently. The lessons of courage, humility, and foresight were now tangible, etched into the valley and the minds of all present. The warriors eventually withdrew slightly, maintaining visibility but allowing the Hale family to resume a sense of normalcy. Thomas walked through his ranch, inspecting the traps and fences, realizing that while preparation and vigilance were important, respect for others and thoughtful action were equally vital. Margaret and the children followed, reassured by his calm demeanor and the understanding that the danger had passed, but that the lessons of the morning would remain forever. The valley returned slowly to its natural state, the tension dissipating as the sun climbed higher. Thomas sat with Margaret and the children, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. He understood now that courage without wisdom could lead to peril, that pride unchecked could create unnecessary danger, and that humility and restraint were as important as strength and determination. The lessons of the morning were clear. Preparation, vigilance, and courage were essential, but so too were foresight, respect, and the ability to listen and learn. In the days that followed, Thomas took careful steps to rebuild and reinforce not only his ranch, but his relationships with the surrounding communities. He reached out to neighboring villages and tribes, fostering communication, understanding, and cooperation. He shared his story, emphasizing the dangers of acting recklessly and the value of humility and wisdom. His actions inspired others, and the tale of the morning when 300 warriors arrived became a story of courage, lesson, and transformation, remembered for generations as a reminder of the balance between bravery and wisdom. Thomas Hale, once stubborn and reckless, had faced a force far greater than he imagined, and had survived not through violence alone, but through recognition of his mistakes, humility, and willingness to learn. The ranch remained his home, the land intact, and his family safe, but Thomas himself was forever changed. He understood now that true courage was not only the ability to face danger, but the ability to recognize one's limits, to respect others, and to act with both determination and wisdom. As the sun set over the valley, casting long shadows across the fields, Thomas stood at the edge of his property, watching the horizon. The events of the morning had left their mark on the land, on the people, and on him. He took a deep breath, feeling gratitude for the lessons learned, for the courage that had guided him, and for the humility that now tempered his pride. The valley, once a place of quiet routine, had become a place of reflection, growth, and understanding. Thomas knew that he would never act recklessly again, that his courage would always be guided by wisdom, and that his actions would honor not only his family and land but the communities around him as well. And so, the story ended not with violence or defeat but with transformation. Thomas Hale, the rancher who had acted recklessly, had faced the consequences of his pride, learned from them, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to the world around him. The memory of the 300 warriors who had arrived that morning remained, a reminder of the delicate balance between courage, wisdom, and respect, a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life.